When early travelers first found a skull of this animal, they thought they'd found the remains of a dinosaur, possibly a pterodactyl. The fact that the skull wasn't fossilized soon disposed of that theory. What they'd found had obviously belonged to a creature that had died quite recently. But what kind of creature? A dodo? Well, not quite, but plainly something almost as extraordinary and very rare, though mercifully not yet extinct. Lacking a more exact description, they might have been forgiven if they'd called it almost a dodo. Some of the earliest observations were made in Zambia's Bangweulu Swamp. Today, this weird creature is also known to exist in small numbers in the dense reed beds of Uganda and the southern Sudan. Because it's comparatively open country, the Bangweulu probably offers the best chance of tracking down this strange animal. The African state of Zambia is bounded by 8 other countries. It contains a huge area of swamp, the Bangweulu. 16 rivers flow into it, only one flows out. After the rains, the swamp is sometimes 160 kilometers long and 110 wide. In the dry season, it shrinks by as much as 15 kilometers all round as its waters evaporate. A favorite adjective to describe swamps is impenetrable. Well, the Bangweulu is certainly that, at least without modern aids to swamp travel. Because of its isolation, wildlife has fortunately thrived. Much of it is highly specialized. Even large animals like antelope are adapted to living in water and running flat out on marshy ground. You'd hardly expect a swamp to catch fire. Yet in the dry season, that's what happens to large parts of the Bangweulu. It's usually started by the few people in the swamps to encourage new grass and reeds. Even in areas that are wet all the year round, the tops of papyrus beds burn well. It's a place of varied and beautiful moods. In the rainy season, it's decorated with great cloudscapes. The clouds eventually empty themselves for 3 months on end to produce an annual rainfall of 120 centimeters. So water and fire between them produce an ideal living place for those creatures that don't mind getting their feet wet. Creatures that include swamp antelope like the sitatunga and these black lechwe engaged in a rutting fight. And among the antelope lives a wide variety of water birds. Great white heron, sacred ibis, open-billed storks, little egrets, a saddle-bill stork chases off an egret trying to steal its fish. This cormorant has been fishing too, and if proof were needed that the Bangweulu is full of fish, a pair of pink-backed pelicans swims by the cormorants as they hang out their wings to dry. This variety of swamp life is there for anyone who can manage to get into the Bangweulu to see in abundance, especially when the water level is high after the rains. But what about seeing the elusive dodo-like creature, the owner of that strange boat-shaped skull? Well, that's an entirely different story. For many years, the only permanent dwelling in this part of the Bangweulu Swamp was a research station where Ian Manning, a biologist, and his wife Kathy were studying the behavior and movements of the Sitatunga. The Mannings share their breakfast with a tame pelican called Fred.
Come on, Fred.
More recently, the research station has been replaced with a much larger building, a centre for wetlands research and for the Zambian National Parks and Wildlife Service. After the rains, the airboats, which Manning uses for his study, are literally parked on his doorstep. But as the water level sinks, he has to walk up to half a mile to reach them. These flat-bottomed boats, driven by a rear-mounted aeroplane propeller, are noisy, but an invaluable means of swamp travel. The water level starts to drop around April. In the dry season, you can reach the Mannings' house in a four-wheel drive vehicle along one boggy bank. Cindy Buxton, who had previously arrived by canoe, now drove in with her equipment to film for the first time the creature that looked like a dodo. Ian Manning had offered to help. He'd seen it many times and had even taken some photographs. The subject of the photograph and of Cindy's quest is Baleniceps rex, the shoebill or whale-headed stork. Ian had often seen shoebills in the distance from the watchtower, but seeing the odd bird, though exciting enough, wasn't what Cindy Buxton had come for. No one had ever filmed the shoebill. Not even the most expert ornithologists knew much about its family life. The Mannings had often seen the odd bird close to the house, but there were many mysteries about its habits. To solve them would be a notable first in the world of natural history. Cindy Buxton had already made a number of successful survival films in Africa, often flying her own plane on location. She'd had some experience of the special difficulties of bird photography. Her first film had dealt with the environmental problems affecting the flamingos of the Rift Valley and Lake Nakuru in particular. Whatever problems filming the shoebills presented, when and if she found a nest, they were unlikely to involve sinking a kind of metal pillbox into the mud and squatting inside under a tin lid while the sun beat down at 40 degrees centigrade. This is what she did at Nakuru to get some of her best shots. It was well worth it. From inside this metal sweat box, she got the first evidence on film of marabou storks attacking young flamingos. At Lake Naivasha, still in the Rift Valley, working conditions were far more pleasant, though the photography problems were just as acute. She was after kingfishers that time. Some, like the pied, are very obliging. But what she really wanted was to film the tiny malachite kingfisher and to get inside its nest with her cameras. She succeeded, without upsetting the birds, by filming through a glass panel. Physically, the most exacting location was the Simien Mountains of Ethiopia, only home of the rare Walia ibex and Simien fox. The Simien precipices are hovered over by eagles and lammergeiers and climbed by troops of gelada baboons. These mountains are surely one of the most spectacular scenic areas on Earth. There's only one way to get there, on muleback, which is just as well. You need to take it slowly to become acclimatized. Once at the top, the team was filming at an altitude of around 4,000 meters. So, like all wildlife photographers, Cindy Buxton was no stranger to difficulties. At least half of wildlife photography is concerned with overcoming unforeseen obstacles. In her case, the first problem when she arrived at Bangweulu was that both the airboats were out of action. Her first reconnaissances had to be made by canoe, at the start of 9 long months in the swamp. After 2 frustrating months, spare parts for the airboats arrived. Ian Manning showed Cindy how to operate them. Driven by a pusher air screw and steered by 2 rudders on either side of the propeller, they draw only an inch or so of water and at speed will plane over reed beds perfectly easily. The great drawback in a wildlife situation is the noise. Their advantage is that they enable you to get around where smooth travel would otherwise be impossible. An airboat will cross any obstacle. Well, almost. When you hit the remains of an old termite mound, built when the swamp was drier, then you've no choice but to get out and push. Soon Cindy was airboating herself around, though wisely taking the precaution of using ear protectors against the din. She didn't expect to find any shoebill nests this way, but it did enable her to survey large areas of the swamp that she hadn't been able to reach before. There was always the chance that she'd spot shoebills flying in the distance. She certainly saw almost everything else the swamp had to offer. A herd of about 100 elephants lives more or less permanently in the wettest area. She often met herds of buffalo splashing along on the edge of the floods. And once or twice, a lion. Bangweulu lions have the reputation of being occasional man-eaters, but they mainly hunt lechwe. And then at last the airboat produced an almost unhoped-for dividend. In the distance she spotted a large grey bird soaring. She stopped the motor. Miraculously the bird landed not too far away. Yes, it was a shoebill. There was nothing to suggest that it had a nest nearby. It may simply have been feeding, but at least it had pinpointed one possible area for closer investigation. The place was a long way from Cindy's base. It was late in the day when she made the long trip back, with the swamp looking its most lovely in the soft light of evening. Cindy confesses that she failed to notice the beauty of her surroundings on that journey. She couldn't think of anything except the shoebill. Was the bird really nesting in that area? It was a long way to drag hides and equipment if she was wrong. More reconnaissance would be needed. Somewhere out in the swamp, only the bird that looks like a dodo knew all the answers. In the end, it was decided that even if the shoebill was nesting there, the area was too distant for practical operations. Something else intervened. For a time, the airboats were urgently required for Ian Manning's Sitatunga study. Conditions were right for catching a number of these marsh antelope. The females were caught simply by making a dive into the shallow water. Males with their sword-sharp horns had to be lassoed, a technique that didn't always succeed. This is filmed in slow motion. The Sitatunga actually move at great speed over a surface that would bog most other animals down. Evolution has equipped them with splayed hooves that distribute the weight over the largest possible area. The slow processes of evolution couldn't anticipate the speed of an airboat. The females are hauled straight aboard, tranquilized, and taken to a kind of field hospital set up on a small patch of dry land where they undergo a thorough veterinary examination. It often seems that there's hardly a wild animal in the world these days that doesn't have to endure this sort of thing. Weighing, hair samples, teeth impressions, throat swabs, numbered collars put around the neck, before being released to take up their normal life again. And then the shoebill quest got the stroke of luck that every wildlife filming operation needs. Ian Manning, spotting from the air, reported a nest not 15 minutes from the house. Airboats were out of the question, but then they wouldn't be needed. This nest was within canoeing range. The first approach was made with the frame for a hide experimentally built onto the canoe. The first sighting was at 100 meters range. Cindy could hardly believe her luck. The shoebill didn't take fright and fly away, and the nest was in an open and ideal area for filming. While she watched, the other parent approached the nest to change over duties. It seemed they already had eggs, or maybe chicks. This was something no other photographer had ever seen, let alone filmed. There was virtually nothing recorded about how the shoebill, or whale-headed stork, behaves in the wild. The female, or was it the male, then dropped some wet grasses into the nest, though for what exact purpose she couldn't yet tell. Meantime, there were other purely practical problems to be solved if anything worthwhile was to be recorded on film. The canoe was shaky, to say the least. What would the birds' reactions be to the camouflaged fabric of the hide? There was only one way to find out: to make an experimental and cautious approach. Cindy and boatman paddled the unwieldy contraption through the reed beds, both with a sneaking feeling that the camouflage material was far too dark for its background. One of the shoebills flapped up from the reeds close at hand. This wasn't particularly worrying, as the bird was nowhere near the nest at the time. With luck, they just surprised it resting or fishing. Then Cindy saw a shoebill circling, probably the bird they just disturbed. It landed and seemed to settle close to the nest. All looked well. At last they reached some shelter behind a clump of reeds. One bird was standing in the open, apparently not unduly troubled. After several minutes, Cindy decided they could risk paddling a little closer. The shoebill stood preening itself in a most relaxed fashion. Through the viewfinder, she could see the other parent on the nest. She took a quick sequence handheld, but it was shaky and not nearly good enough. At this point, she was very careful not to go too far. The sitting bird had in fact taken off. Obviously, the campaign had to be planned with great care if everything wasn't to be lost. The bird that looks almost like a dodo had been found in Zambia's Bangweulu Swamp. But the difficulties of filming it at its nest in such an open place still had to be overcome. Cindy Buxton had now built a more stable hide of reeds that matched the surroundings perfectly. When she pushed this the last 100 yards up a narrow channel, one of the shoebills just stood and watched. An excellent omen. Quite soon, the nesting pair accepted Cindy completely. Now she was able to get a close look at what must be one of the weirdest birds in the world. The birds clap with their bill as a display when they change over at the nest, but possibly too as a warning to predators to keep away. All wildlife cameramen have split personalities. They're part filmmakers, part naturalists. What was so exciting from a naturalist's point of view was that no eyes had ever witnessed what the camera was now recording. It was almost as good as discovering a new species. In addition, the bird was a born star and had no inhibitions about the camera. Within a week, the birds accepted the hide, only 10 meters away from the nest. One of the main duties of whichever bird was on the nest was collecting water. a great deal of water. It carried this back to the nest in its enormous bill. And poured it over its two large eggs to cool them. They're then turned over with a large hook on the end of its beak. The shoebill stands over 1.5 meters high and weighs at least 4 kilograms, quite a weight for a marsh bird. So those long toes are essential. It's the same weight-spreading principle used by the sitatunga. The shoebill's long toes are handy for preening too. Even when standing on the nest, it needs all the support it can get. 1 meter across and built of dried grass and reeds, the nest itself is floating on the bog beneath. Why were the shoebills so trusting? Possibly because, like most wild creatures who haven't seen much of the human race, they haven't learnt yet to distrust it. There wasn't going to be much action until the eggs hatched out. Meantime, there was plenty of action elsewhere. One day, a pilot of the Zambian Air Force brought in a large cargo plane and landed nearly in the heart of the Bangweulu Swamp on the short grass strip meant only for light aircraft. The presence of another Zambian Air Force plane and all those fuel drums were signs that a special operation was about to take place. An operation inspired by the President of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda himself. As a boy, the President used to watch black lechwe all around his home at Chinsali, 200 kilometers from here. They had long since disappeared. A wildlife enthusiast, the President wanted to see lechwe back at his home. The Bangweulu Swamp holds 30,000. So the President asked the Game Department to catch 100, which the Air Force would transport. The catchers went into action, taking care to round up a balanced herd of males and females of breeding age. With so many lechwe to choose from, they could afford to be selective. At last, the catchers spot a female they want. A fine young male next. Manning and his team aim to catch about 30 lechwe a day. They'll be tranquilized and penned before being flown out in the plane. Meantime, back at the shoebill nest, things are happening once again. The trusting birds have now allowed Cindy to move the hide within 3 meters. At first sight, there appears to be little change in the situation. Both birds are very much in attendance. Cindy now knows that the male is taller, slimmer, and has a much darker bill. The female is preening herself at the nest, and with good reason. The first fluffy grey chick has hatched. It's 1 day old and just 10 centimeters long. Its tiny beak gives no hint of the outlandish shoebill it will become. It will be over 4 months before it looks like its parents, and that's a fact no one knew until this film was made. The last of the President's 100 black lechwe are coming in. Once they're loaded aboard, the plane will make its final takeoff en route for Kenneth Kaunda's old home at Chinsali. Tranquilized and blindfolded, they're laid in the hold of the big transport for their 2-hour flight. Unlike many uneasy human air travelers, the lechwe will sleep throughout their trip. At Chinsali, special transport is waiting to receive them. After all, a president's guests deserve nothing less than VIP treatment. Not that the lechwe are in any state to appreciate the fact. They're still blissfully asleep, wrapped in sacks, the males with their horns sheathed in rubber to prevent accidents to handlers or fellow passengers. The significance of such an operation is immense. For the head of state to be so wholeheartedly behind conservation is a trump card in any country. When a shoebill takes to the air, it ceases to be a grotesque comic character. It becomes a master of powered or soaring flight, like its cousins the marabou stork, or the European white stork, or the graceful wattled crane that has a nest close by. The crane's eggs haven't yet hatched, but now the shoebill parents are having to work flat out to catch fish. Unlike the crane, which is still incubating, they've got young to feed. The second shoebill chick has hatched successfully. The male delivers a catfish. When the chicks are very small, the parents usually remove the head, presumably because it's hard to digest. The bigger chick hatched nearly a week ahead of the younger one. Already it's getting the larger share of the food. Watching the shoebills at work, it is clear why the Bangweulu Swamp is a fisherman's paradise. It's one of Zambia's largest fisheries, in spite of its inaccessibility. Inevitably, the fishing has an impact on the wildlife, but among the reeds and pools, there seems to be room enough for fishermen and birds to coexist. Indeed, the fishermen are almost as much a part of the Bangweulu as the lechwe and the Sitatunga. Mostly they fish by setting gill nets in the open channels. In the background, wattled cranes walk around, accepting them as part of the scene. Everything the Bangweulu fisherman does is limited by use of the dugout canoe, without which existence would be impossible. In the wet season, the fishermen live on the fringes of the swamp, making short journeys from their villages to catch the fish which they smoke or dry in the sun. Very few make more than a bare living. Fishing methods are largely the traditional African ones. Basket traps woven from reeds are laid down in open channels. Circular reed baskets are clapped down at random in the hope of trapping fish underneath. All these methods work, and the only concession to modern times is the use of outboard motors on some of the dugouts. Wildlife enthusiasts can be thankful that the shallow water and the dense vegetation of the swamp prevent the use of modern boats and mass harvesting techniques. In the dry season, when the size of the swamp shrinks considerably, the fishermen have an even harder time. Then they build temporary grass huts out in the swamp on any ground they can find, usually where there are old termite mounds. The Bangweulu has a habit of changing its levels because of climatic differences and because the actual swamp bed tilts. It's in a part of Africa which still hasn't quite made up its mind how to settle down. So the high ground on which these huts are built could, not so long ago, have been high and dry ground. A lucky dip with the basket, or a lightning dart with that enormous bill. Both are traditional methods, both work well enough, though this time the shoebill has come up with a beak full of wet reeds for its nest. In both shoebill and wattled crane's nests, there have been dramatic developments. In the case of the crane, it's a happy event. A large, active brown chick has emerged, while a second egg remains to be hatched. It's tempting to describe what's happened in the shoebill nest as an unhappy event. Only the older chick has survived. In natural terms, it's probably inevitable and even beneficial to the species. Now the chick is feeding voraciously on water snakes. With large birds, it's quite common for the younger and weaker of two chicks to die. These are the harsh principles of natural selection. Although she was now keeping an almost daily watch, Cindy Buxton never knew what happened to that younger chick. It could have been snatched by a ground predator or by a bird of prey circling overhead as this parent shoebill is circling. If it just died of cold or starvation, then it's highly probable one of the parents would have disposed of it. By now, the shoebills had come so completely to accept Cindy as part of their daily lives that she was able to remove the top of her hide and stand up to film over it. This is a fairly typical changeover ceremony, with a female bringing in a bunch of wet grass, either as a greeting or more likely to build up the nest in the swamp, which is floating but gradually subsiding under the weight of the birds. That is why the parents are always piling up more material. There are usually 2 changeovers a day, morning and afternoon. everything being done at a slow, stately march. The shoebill is a bird that doesn't believe in unseemly haste. The relieved bird isn't really off duty. Its job now is to catch catfish or water snakes. During the hottest parts of the day, one of the parents, the male in this case, stands protectively over the chick. If one fishing ground doesn't pay off, then a little aerial reconnaissance is done to find a more profitable one. The neighbouring cranes are out searching for food too, in their case insects, worms and frogs. At around 6 weeks, the shoebill chick is nearly 45 centimetres high. It begs continually for food, but sometimes gets a drink instead. The parents no longer pour water on it simply to cool it. Feathers are now beginning to show on its wings, though its body is still covered in grey down. One more changeover. This time the female who has just come back on duty has brought a large catfish in her bill. As soon as the male makes his solemn exit, she deposits it in the nest. When the chick seems reluctant to do anything about it, she picks it up as if to encourage him. The male stops and looks back, interested. The young bird finally gets the fish in its beak and makes a gallant, if lengthy, attempt to swallow it, along with a lot of nesting material. Just the tail sticking out now, plus a bit of grass, but the giant meal is as good as gone. Even at the 7th or 8th week, the youngster is still totally dependent on its parents. The weather is now extremely hot, and it's being given a great deal of water, sometimes with a garnishing of weeds. One parent bird now spends a good part of the day just standing at the nest, acting as a sunshade. Until now, the chick has been unable to stand. At the 10th week, it can struggle to its feet for very short periods. Food is brought home at an ever-increasing rate and disposed of likewise. 11 weeks, and the young bird is really starting to look very much like a dodo, or maybe a shoebill. Now the female often lies down on the nest beside it. During the 12th and 13th weeks, the parents are far less inclined to give in to its begging for food or water. It's a way of breaking the news that it will eventually have to provide for itself. Its legs are growing far stronger despite the occasional undercarriage failure. Wings are developing powerfully and get regular exercise. It's safe from most predators now, and the parents quite often leave it alone at the nest, sometimes fishing as much as 500 meters away. But of course it doesn't beg in vain all the time. It still needs great quantities of food and water. It's growing faster than ever before. "14 weeks have gone by since it hatched. With every day that passes, the young shoebill becomes increasingly restless. Sometimes it walks a short distance from the nest and continually flexes its flight muscles. It's now nearly as big as its mother sitting beside it in the nest. Is it watching with an instinctive eagerness for flight as its parents soar over the reed beds? One should never attribute human reactions to animals, but it's difficult not to imagine there's a hint of pride, or at least of achievement, as these two weird birds walk away from the nest, their parental job nearly done. The distinctive tuft is there. The pale swiveling eye is there. The first flight feathers are now nearly perfectly formed. It is indeed almost a dodo, Bangweulu Swamp version. This is week 15 of its life. 1 week more, and it will be able to fly and keep up with its parents for quite long distances. For a while, even then, they'll continue to feed it away from the nest in the security of the deep reed beds. One week more before almost total freedom. A week to strengthen those legs, build up the muscles in those wings. Instinctively, the young shoebill knows that a bird's survival and its success in the air, particularly the success of a soaring bird like a stork, depends on the good condition of all its feathers, so it preens its new plumage continually. And having preened, it makes its first shaky takeoffs. It may have grown up to look like a dodo, but there is one significant difference. The dodo never flew at all. The shoebill, for all its strange appearance, has survived better than the dodo, far from the disturbance of the 20th century. It's better known now than when Cindy Buxton brought back this first film of it, but it's still something of a mystery.